Welcome. Välkomna. Welcome all of you to this seminar arranged by the Swedish Institute in Alexandria in Egypt. My name is Marika Grisel. I'm a freelance journalist. I shall say that this seminar is being live recorded, so it can be seen live over the web. And we will finish 3:45. So if you want to see the football, you will have time to find a place. We are so grateful that you are here. We have a fantastic panel, and I will give a very brief introduction just now. The topic is, of course, dialogue to break the vicious circle of polarization and populism. We have a fantastic panel. I'm so delighted. Afra Nasser, you're a Swedish Gemini award-winning journalist who lives in exile here in Sweden, about 7 years since you came to Sweden. And you described the situation in Yemen as there is no freedom whatsoever, no press freedom, and of course a horrific war raging. It's far too dangerous for you to go back and for journalists to work at all in your country. In your home country. We have Anas Al-Tigriti. You are CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation based in London. And you are focusing on dialogue between Europe and the Middle East, focusing on dialogue between people from different cultures, languages, and we will delighted to have you here. You're also a often seen and heard commentator in different news media, among them BBC, of course. We have Sahara Langi. You are an academic, peace activist, gender activist. You are the founder of Libyan Women for Peace, one of the founders, an NGO. You reside in Cairo at the moment. It's for you the same. Can't go back to Libya, to your home country at the moment, because of the very difficult situation that activists, journalists, peace activists are facing, among others. And Peter Weiderud, you are the head of the Swedish Institute in Alexandria, an institute which is founded upon the idea of creating dialogue between Europe and the Middle East, North Africa. But as you described yesterday during our seminar, also now a platform to create a space for dialogue within countries in the Middle East, where the populism and polarization is growing. And you, of course, are very welcome. And we will open up the floor for some questions towards the end if we get the time for that. One can ask a very important question to try to understand where we're standing today is what drives populism. And we could also ask the same question, what drives polarization? And we have to make a distinction between the two. So if I could start here with you, how do you see this? What is the factors at the moment that drives populism in Europe? But also if you look into the Middle East and North Africa, what is the driving force of the polarization within those societies, and how does it feed into each other?
I think, first of all, I would like to, admire the Swedish Institute attention or care to have this panel. I think since it's an election year in Sweden, probably the most focus would be on domestic issues, but they are giving, time and a place to discuss Sweden's relation to the world. And I think that also has to be something that any responsible Swede citizen should consider and how Swedish relation to the world when we want to vote at the end of this year. I think we live in a world that dominated by us versus them kind of mentality, and it's growing by a day. But if you look at, the broader picture, when we have like leaders like Donald Trump, or that, or the sentiment in Europe, like the Brexit exit, these kind of phenomena, they're not creating the us versus them kind of atmosphere. It's actually the us versus them mentality that created Donald Trump, or leaders like Donald Trump, or in Egypt like Sisi, or the Brexit exit. I think it's very, very important to understand this kind of polarization that is in each country. If you look around the world, it's a growing division when it comes to the identity issues. Who are we? Who are they? And it's very important to see what are the common values between these nations in order to bring people together and find like an atmosphere where people feel represented by their leaders and not feel that they're marginalized. So if I look at Sweden in particular, the migration issues are really, becoming a heated debate, and that, as a newly Swede and a former refugee, I think it's very important to find this new energy in the country and find a way to have a common identity altogether.
So from your point of view, one of the issues could be economic factors that pulls people apart and create this populism. From your point of view, what would you say are the factors that drives the populism today?
Well, thank you, Marika, and thank you to the Swedish Institute in Alexandria, and thank you all for being here today. I think that I agree entirely with Afrah that we do live in a polarized world. We do live in a world that is more attracted towards an us versus them, a sort of narrative and position. And that's been manifested in real-time policies. It's not just a narrative on the discursive level, but it's now filtered through into the social psyche. And that's when it becomes a real problem, and maybe we'll elaborate on that. And I think one of the main reasons for that is the fact that we have to admit, and without descending into cynicism, but we have to admit that there has been a failure on a grand scale. There has been a failure within political establishments. There has been a failure in terms of the economic structure that, let's say, the capitalist markets, the leaders in the free markets in the world today, ourselves in Europe, as well as North America, have actually provided a very faulty system for the world to work in. And we've just barely emerged from what happened 10 years ago in terms of the economic collapse. I do think that the political structure of the past decade has not answered the questions of people on the streets. I think that communities across Europe are still yearning for the fulfillment of the ideals of what we speak about. We speak about democracy, we speak about human rights, we speak about the liberation of our markets as well as our people. Yet, when it comes to real practice, it seems that very cynical, interest-driven policies and tendencies trump, sorry to use, but they override the sort of ethical and moral kind of labels that we pronounce. So I think that one of the main reasons why it is that we live in an us against them world today, why it is that we have a president of probably the strongest nation in the world that is absolutely outside the political establishment, that has absolutely no record within the political establishment. And that is, by the way, that is going to happen more and more and more. Even the French president, for instance, he is also from outside the political class. I think it's because essentially the political establishment has failed to provide the answers that communities and societies have been yearning for.
Just briefly, would you have thought 8, 6, 7 years ago that you would see this rise of populism in Europe now, particularly if we concentrate on Europe? I mean, would you have seen this? Could you have believed that we have this kind of populist movements?
We are seeing the emergence of political parties, of individuals, of policies, and of narratives that only 5 or 6 years ago would have been absolutely unimaginable. And that, I think, is the mark not only of Europe, but also North America and probably even beyond.
Sarah, from your point of view, what is the factors that drive populism, but also if you want to move on towards North Africa, Middle East, the polarization that you see in these countries, because I think these two feeds on each other, and I think Peter will elaborate a little bit more about that, but from your point of view.
Well, I think there is a crisis in the international world order, and by that it includes our world, our part of the world. I think I cannot see this out of context of post-colonialism. The crisis of identities in the time of globalization. I see political grievances, especially for the question of Palestine. And these issues, we live in one world. It all comes together. And so post-colonial experience of the very fragile modern nation states in our region, I think that's the elephant in the room and that we dare not discuss. The nation states in our region are very fragile and have been throughout very fragile. And so with the movement that happened, the so-called Arab Spring and the revolutions that took place back in 2001 have brought many issues to the front. The regional, the minor unit of identities. I think that is something that you can compare with the rise of populism here. The other identities that it's not the national identity. Here in Europe, you have a collapse of maybe the idea of Europe, of the European Union, and the rise of nationalism. Back in our region, we have the crisis of nationalism and nation states and the rise of sectarian identities. And so the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of 4 decades of post-colonialism authoritarianism, post-colonial authoritarianism, which were supported by the West, it's all coming back, and it's the payback today that we see.
So I mean, and these things are feeding into each other. It seems like, you know, the populist movement in Europe are being scared of more extremist movements, maybe in the Middle East or North Africa, and in the same way, the hate towards Muslims in Europe is feeding into a frustration and a more difficult situation could be in the Middle East to find possibilities to have a dialogue. Peter, this is something that you have used some time to think about, I think, in Alexandria. Where to take the dialogue now? Where are we standing at the moment, and where do we find some kind of common ground? Because we're actually losing out, all of us at the moment. This is a major failure, I would say.
The Swedish Institute in Alexandria was established about 20 years ago, at the time when we thought there was a need for Europe to understand Middle East, North Africa better, and for Middle East, North Africa to understand Europe better, the dialogue between civilization. We saw a risk for a clash between civilization. The clash we are seeing today is not so much between, but within. And within both of us, both within Europe and within the Middle East. And as my colleague described, we have a situation where the political structures are not able to provide hope for the future, to provide a good way forward that people trust. The institutions are failing. Then people is turning somewhere else. They turn to culture, they turn to religion, they turn inwards. They might also turn against each other. And we see a growing intolerance, populism, polarization, both in Europe and the Middle East. And as a Swede, of course, I feel a lot of pain when I see an election campaign in Sweden is also paying off by finding victims, be them migrants, be them Muslims, be them whatever they are. This is something that will increase polarization, that will increase the problem, and that will also make our own society much less functioning. So we cannot only blame the Middle East for this problem. We are part of the vicious circle, and we need to see how we can address it. I think Christians are not different from Muslims here, and Europeans are not different from Arabs. We are basically the same human being with the same hopes and with the same failures and everything. What I see the main difference is that in the Middle East, North Africa, the institutions are so much weaker. The institution of free media, democracy, human rights, etc. So when you have this polarization in the Middle East, it goes immediately into violence. While in Europe it goes to intolerance, it goes to unpleasant political behavior, but still we are protecting ourselves as long as we keep the institution. But if we continue to tear down our institutions, be it human rights, Brexit in the UK, we will have a similar and growing problem. This is what happened in the 30s, and we are not vaccinated against it forever.
And we are standing here because we care, of course, and you are sitting here care as well, because we actually are living in a global world. And if we then look back into history, have we learned everything? Is there anything what you see from history back in the 30s, for example, in Europe? Or you can even go to the breakdown of Yugoslavia in the early 90s. Have we learned anything from the history? We can go through the panel again. Can you see anything which can be useful today, or what is different, and where we can find a key to move on maybe and find a dialogue within countries and regions, but also globally?
I'm not I'm not a historian here, but what I can tell from my own history is something that Yemen, even though Yemen is in a deep chaos and a raging war, but I think there is something that Yemenis could teach Europeans, contrary to the stereotype. That's tribalism, and it's exactly what's happening. If we look at the US or in Britain, people coming together because they don't see the system is really, resonating to their needs and aspirations. And that's what Yemenis, for many years, tribalism has been that, system that could protect and support the people. There is a classical saying that the problem in Yemen is that the states act as a tribe and the tribe acts as a state. It's not. I don't see a problem with populism. I don't see a problem with people coming together and trying to counter what the elites are not, hearing or listening. Is
That's the football.
The football already. All right.
Another form of tribalism.
Yeah, true. So the only problem that I see is when we create that mentality, us versus them, and how one side is supporting the devastation of the other. Peter mentioned how the institutions are not working or are not competent in the majority of the states in the Middle East. It is because they're full of war. They're full of conflicts. And who's supporting these conflicts? Which disastrous foreign policies that are creating these conflicts? Which states' weapons that are invested and being used in the other part of the region? It's the West. It's Sweden. It's the US. It's United Kingdom. So it's very important to address these issues. And for many decades, if we take Iraq, if we take Afghanistan, if we take Syria, if we take Yemen, I speak here as both Swedish and Yemeni citizen, and I think it's such a shame that Swedish weapons are being used in Yemen. When we have this, platform talking about how to strengthen dialogue, I think this is the only hopeful thing, that at least as a Swede, I can condemn freely that Swedish weapons are being sold to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and actually there is, an office in United Arab Emirates, a Swedish weapon sub office in United Arab Emirates, and that is a signal that Sweden wants to expand its military, trades in the region, and that's such a shame. I think that's so shameful.
Well done.
So what you bring up here is the double standards, which has also a long history, of course. You mentioned the colonial history and its what has come with that, and now the double standards you mentioned. What would you, if you look back into the history, mention as a reason? Could we learn something from history? Is there anything we could do different?
I'm also not a historian, but I've read quite extensively on history, and the very first lesson that everyone needs to know about history is that no one learns from history. We keep doing the same mistakes time and time and time again. It's as though we're in this perpetual cycle. The second lesson in history, we always, whenever we emerge in a crisis, we will always say, never again. But we also always end up with the very same factors that led us to the initial crisis in the first place. So, unfortunately, this is something that we need to have in mind whenever we come to try to understand exactly how it is that we came here. The thing that politicians say, and Peter will know more about this, politicians will always, whenever we talk to them about what's happening in Iraq, for instance, a failed state now, after it was a semblance of a state, what's happening in Libya, what's happening, the answer is, well, we are here now, let's not discuss the past. Let's decontextualize the crisis that we have and start thinking about the problem today. When that, on every other logical level, does not work. When a serial killer comes before a court of law, they need to know the background of the serial killer, why it is that that person ended up being a serial killer. Without that context, you can't understand why this person did these heinous crimes. The very same here. And again, when we talk about history, today one of the issues that governs every single political party across Europe, it is the number one theme and the number one issue on every single manifesto across European elections, is the issue of migration. But it's exactly like a doctor who's treating a terminally ill cancer patient who is dying, yet focusing entirely on the headache that they have and trying to plow them with aspirins when actually the patient is dying from another more important disease. Migration is a system. It's not the cause root of anything. Migration is a symptom of why these people, and I think I mentioned this to you, Marika, just earlier, people haven't come to Britain, to my country, or to your country, Sweden, with all due respect, and forget about today, for the weather. They haven't come here for the weather. They have come here simply because their lands, their homelands, where their families live, where they grew up, where they have loved ones and histories and legacies, are no longer safe or fit for human habitat. And that's why they have left seeking areas where they can behave as human beings, they can exist as human beings. The problem is those conditions back home in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in other places, have been directly or indirectly perpetuated by immoral, unethical foreign policies by Europe and by North America. Now, this is something that we need to address. When we address that properly, then we will be able to stop, if we wish, the flow of migrants. We will be then begging people to come from Africa, from Asia, to sustain our economies, to pay for our old age pensioners in their retirement years. We will be begging them to come. We will be paying them to come and not treating them as the way that we are right now.
So we're talking about double standards. We're talking about a system failure in large parts of the world, which makes people move. Trying to move into some kind of better safety. But of course, we also in this growing, we're living in a global world where we have leadership also we'll talk about maybe countries like in the Middle East and parts of Europe, of course, leaders who are thriving on corruption, rule. They don't rule with human rights. They jail people who just demands decent human realities. Now, in which way does that fit into this narrative of populism and polarization? If we look into that, because I mean, of course, policies from North America and West Europe has been bad. We have double standards, but there are also people who are gaining from corruption within these countries. If we now look at that, Middle East and North America, for example, North Africa.
If I pick the example again of migration and what today leaders call a global migration crisis, it's actually the 2/3 of migrants are basically from 5 countries. It's Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. And so if we look into these 5 countries, we can easily find out that it is the failure of international military intervention in these countries that created the migration crisis that we call a global migration crisis. So it is our policies, the policies in Europe that is coming back at Europe. And it's more of, I think it's a narrative of fear, and the paradigm behind it, it's securitized approaches rather than focusing on dialogue and cooperation. And so it is, when you mentioned the history lesson, for example, in Libya, now it's asked to address and to take the lead responsibility in safeguarding the Mediterranean shore, whereas we know Libya, after the intervention in 2011, has become officially a failed state. And there are no functioning state institutions, no viable or functioning security institution there. So these militias who have committed atrocities, who are loyal to the internationally recognized government, are asked to guard the shores and to make sure that none of the migrants who are running for their lives because of another legacy, colonialism, and it's a long story. And so Libyans, after 2011 now, they're supposed to guard regardless of the atrocities they've committing against Libyans themselves. And so we can look at this and we ask, is it a crisis in migration? Is it a global crisis? Or is it a crisis, a political crisis in Europe? And I'm someone like who read, as a historian and studied political science, I read Hegel's, like anyone, and Kant. And I think of the right of his hospitality. And is it relevant anymore to the migration crisis? I think the crisis is in the values of Europe at the moment, when Europe itself does not agree on a foreign policy and want a country like Libya, which is a failed state, to take the responsibility of keeping away migrants.
So I get it, and I really think, but I still would like to come back to the responsibility of current leadership in these failed states as well. You know, I mean, of course, I always want us to say something about that, because there is a lack of leadership in many countries and a lack of policy as well. But maybe Peter wants to fill in something on that level.
No, I think it's important to see that there is a shared responsibility, and there is a shared responsibility in particular when it comes to breaking this circle. Europe cannot do it alone, and the Middle East cannot do it alone. We are in it together, and we need to improve our institutions. We need to improve the attitude of accepting each other, of tolerance. I think we can agree here that we need institutions. We need stronger institutions. We need better institutions. And the institutions are failing. That's part of the problem.
We have a big institution called the UN.
Yeah. We have a big institution called the UN, which need to be strengthened, of course, to be able to do its work. We need support to be able to do its work. I mean, the UN in the Middle East is so little respected, mainly because of the failure of the UN on the Palestinian issue. That is one example. But I think the division I see is that there is a constructive critique against the institution, how to improve, and there is a destructive approach. The constructive approach comes more from young people than from old people. It comes more from women than from men. It comes a bit more from educated than low-educated. And the destructive approach, like we have with Donald Trump that we have described, like we have with Brexit, like we have with the growing right-wing populism in Europe, and including in the Middle East, that is really urgent to address and try to understand. But we need, of course, to strengthen the role of women, the role of youth, who actually wants to take responsibility. There we have a lot of hope in the region as well as in Europe. But at this moment, they are too marginalized.
I mean, on this particular issue, I think that it's if I was an Arab despot, if I was an Arab dictator, okay, what would be my incentive to democratize? What would be my incentive to allow for human rights? What would be the incentive? The incentive would be essentially fear from repercussions on my system and on my stability from the powerful nations who have my bank accounts, who hold to my federal reserves, who have a grip over the validity of my travel documents so that I can travel or not, on my children being educated in the schools of Paris, London, and New York. That is going to be my incentive. But when there is no such incentive, when any Arab leader knows for a fact that even if they brutally crushed, any sign, any emergence of a democracy in their country, the West will only be concerned about, well, the main thing is keep them inside your country. I don't care what you do with them. Just make sure they don't reach to my doorsteps. When that is the reality, then there is no incentive to democratize. There is no incentive to open up. And it's very, very important that we realize, that you realize here in Sweden, that I realize wherever I am in the UK or the such, that we all realize that we're no longer states that are isolated by borders. These lines have clearly been proven to be lines in the sand. They mean absolutely nothing. Hundreds of thousands of migrants, if they have the will, enough will, they will get to wherever they want to get to. So we need to understand, following the economic crisis whereby two financial institutions in America collapsed and people lost their homes in Japan, throughout the entire world, and through the migrant crisis, that we are no longer isolated from what's happening in the Middle East. And therefore, it is in Sweden's best interest. It is in Britain's best interest. It is in France's best interest that the Middle East is democratized, has human rights upheld, transparency, laws that liberate women and whoever is oppressed and the such, and that there are laws of equality. Once we have that, then we can start to solve the many, many issues that confront us today.
I think many of us who follow this and actually daily are concerned do see commonality between these despots, whether they are in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe. Yeah. This is just one, how strongmen subvert democracy. And many of these strongmen, if we might call them that, they thrive on corruption. And of course, if they were to stay in power, they stay in power through corruption. And were they to leave, as you said, they could be prosecuted. I would like to bring us back just to Europe for a moment and see, when we see the rise of populism in Europe, who is benefiting from that, from a breakup of the European Union? We have even parties now in Sweden who would like to see a Swexit, I think it's called. Who is gaining from this kind of populism and polarization and tribalism, to use maybe a word, Which tribe do you belong to? Because that's the only security you have. Now, who benefits, would you say? Which nation, which forces?
I think from the west to the east, there is a rise of the far right. If you look at, extremist group like Daesh or Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or it's the far right. It's the extremism, and even if you look at Europe and the US, it's another form of extremism. And I think it's very, very scary to live in a war that is so extreme in that way. I don't know how the fate of Swedish democracy would be, like if Sweden will also break out from the European Union. Anything is likely to happen. We never expected Donald Trump to win, but since he won, anything could happen. And I think overall, this reflects how there is really like a very severe political crisis or like leadership, a global leadership is missing. There is, we were talking about this earlier, how the American political leadership is sinking in. They're losing, control and dealing with conflicts where it's like a role they had for a long time. I mean, we can debate on how, they were like good or bad, but there is a saying that says God created war so Americans could know geography. So anyway, let's put that aside. But I think this is also an opportunity for Europe to come in and find way in taking a global role in political leadership. It's a great example what happened, just briefly, a great example what happened with the US withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran. And European leaders really came together and they were shocked. And they tried to find ways, and they're still, in discussion and how to find a way to hold into that deal, regardless of, the American role. But that was for me something really, hopeful, that there is an opportunity for European countries to take a lead in, this crisis in political leadership.
Well, I think many of us would like to see these nations, which say at least they have similar values. But once again, who is gaining from this? In the world today, we have movements of money, we have movements of goods, but that's free. And we have movements of information. The social network is actually driving this as well. And we know that during the election in America and through Brexit, there were Russian trolls, for example, who were influencing.
In that sense, I think it's very important to differentiate between globalization and globalism.
Yeah.
I think in globalization, we really succeeded in finding this, globalized world, but the ideology of a globalism where we're all equal and have free open space and we're all really sharing an equal and prosperous economy, that is not happening. You find whether global terrorism happening in the West or civil wars and regional wars happening in the East, it's definitely a violent world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can agree on that there is enormous problems. But who is gaining, would you say?
Well, I don't think that anyone actually stands to gain from the rise of populism, and particularly the extreme and the far right. Now, but let me just be slightly controversial and say that every single human community, whether they be a society, a group, whatever they are, there is always that wide spectrum from far right to far left and everything in between. That's the nature of humanity. You can't convince someone on the far right to come towards the center, or someone on the far left to come towards the center. You can't convince everyone. So there's always going to be that spectrum. That is the nature of human beings. However, successful societies, thriving societies, are those that keep the extremists on both sides of the spectrum on the margins. They speak freely. They're right to think whatever, they have the right to think whatever they are. However, they do not pollute the mainstream. The mainstream, the 85% remains solid to their ideals. And those are what govern, what paint society. However, what's happening today, and this is where I am extremely concerned, for Europe, for my country, for yours, for every single country throughout the West, I'm concerned that what's happening is, rather than those voices being on the peripheries or on the margin of society, they are now part of the mainstream. The problem is not that now we have, for instance, the British National Party of old in Britain that is now governing. That's not the issue. Or that, for instance, UKIP, the UK Independence Party, becoming part of the government in Britain, although it's happening in other countries. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the narrative, discourse, and ideology of the far right has now become adopted by Labour, by the Conservatives, by the Liberal Democrats. That's even worse. That's even worse, because now, all of a sudden, those same views which were totally rejected, totally refused only 5 to 7 years ago, have now become respectable. Why? Because it's mainstream politicians like Tony Blair, like George W. Bush, like from mainstream parties who are actually saying these things. So in a way, just like Nigel Farage from the UKIP party once said, he said, I don't need to say it. The government is saying it for me.
What are they scared of? Is that what's driving them? They're scared of losing power.
That's the thing. Unfortunately today, because of political short-termism, because every single elected politician, the very first thing they have in their minds when they receive office is, will they win in the next 4 years? So they can't be brave enough to challenge the public narrative. So therefore it's, in a sense, I'm sorry, Marika, but the media widely, as well as societies and where the votes go, and parties are going wherever the vote is. And that is problematic.
We will open for one or two questions, but I know Peter wants to say something.
No, I think that, I mean, it's clear. I think that some people believe that they will benefit from populism, and you benefit from narrowing yourself in. There is a Danish poet called Johannes Kierkegaard who has written a very nice poem that is one of the nicest Swedish hymns, actually, saying that only in openness you can flourish, you can grow. If you close yourself in, you be choking and you wither away. I live in Alexandria. Alexandria 70 years ago had 22 nationalities, enormously open economy, a cultural life that was close to New York. 300,000 Greeks, 45,000 Jews, 15,000 Armenians. All this is gone because they closed themselves in. The economy is shrinking, the cultural life is going away. Of course, the policy of Trump with the borders, walls to Mexico, going out of international trade agreement will make the whole country much poorer. We know that. But in the short term, some people feel that they benefit from it because that's the nature of populism. And that's the same with Sweden. By saying that immigrants is coming here to take our jobs, when we know that they are creating more jobs and they make the society richer, can, in the short term, give comfort to some individual. And of course, power is there. So we need, of course, to together take a responsibility to show the bigger picture. Otherwise, it will not work.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting to listen to you, and we have touched on many important parts which feed into each other. There is one or two questions. We have one or two questions. Yeah, you have a question. Is there a microphone? Please state your... There it is. You can take it if you want. State your name, please.
Är den på? Nu är den på. Hi, my name is Helena. I remain confounded by the fact that, contrary to your description of the political failures, at least in Sweden, we've had 10 years of uninterrupted progression economically for all classes except for the very lowest. So even though you have the 1%er and the 10%er, you still have a very, very good curve for the middle classes in Sweden. So I will go back to your country.
Take your question, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
Given the economic situation, why do we still have this populism? What, contrary to everything we've seen in history?
Yeah, you can give it there. So who would like to add that? Because Sweden might be perceived as different. Statistically, that's the point, I think.
For me, it might be very simple, but I see any warmongers discourse or any populist discourse, it basically, and you follow the money. It's arms trade, it's all related to economy, making more money, either through civil wars, more destruction, and then come with reconstruction plans. So it's money for me, and it's arms trade.
I would say people are afraid. Generally speaking,
of course. Who makes?
Well, that's the thing.
Afraid?
I mean, in many surveys, some conducted by newspapers, some by institutes, it shows that there is a level of concern that is almost unprecedented throughout Europe, to varying levels, of course. But at least in my country, there is extreme concern. Now, that might be driven because of Brexit and the uncertainties that brings. It might be because of a wave of violent attacks, terrorists or otherwise. It might be because of various economic issues, people losing their jobs, for instance. But the thing is that you have to recognize that this feeling of concern, call it fear, call it being worried, this drives the kind of political tendency. This is capitalized upon by the overwhelming discourse, by the overriding narrative that wants to explain exactly why it is that you're concerned. You're concerned for your job because there are more and more people coming from outside the UK, Polish, Ukrainian, Arabs, Muslims. They are coming to your country. They are taking these jobs. That is why. So don't blame the government. Blame the fact that the European Court for Human Rights, for instance, insisted that we bring in migrants so that the freedom of movement of employees. It's very simple. It's very easy, very cynical to play on people's concerns and fears. And that is unfortunately what's happening. If you read one of the most widely read publications in Britain, and online I have been told, one of the most read in the world, the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail, if you read it, I swear, read it for 3 consecutive days, you'll have fights with your own wife, husband, partner, spouse, children. You will be depressed to no end. You will be reading from front to back about bad news, about how you should be afraid, about bad statistics, about crime, about immigrants, about how the country is changing, how we're losing. And therefore, I honestly do not blame the ordinary citizen who gets their news from the likes of the Daily Mail. And there are hundreds throughout Europe of publications just like the Daily Mail.
I'm sorry, Anas, you sound like Donald Trump. I'm sorry. Like
you
blame the media.
We need to stop then, briefly.
Yeah. No, I think for me, it's if we look at Sweden in particular, it's as a refugee and as a Swede, I think it's social and cultural marginalization. It's if you look at how, every time there is any election, the discussions usually focus on migration and race and not really about class. I think if we focus about class and how we're, all segment of societies, nobody should live in poverty in Sweden. Nobody, regardless of your color. I think if we focus on that, there will not be, the Swede Brexit idea to begin with. Yeah, that's just quickly.
We are coming to the closure of this session. We have touched on double standards, on history, on short-term thinking by politicians, of people being scared, of tribalism. But we also touched on some of the positive signs. There are people who, of course, are very concerned and wants to find dialogue. Young people, women, often those who are most marginalized at the first also being marginalized in society is falling apart. These people are prepared. We are prepared. And remember, half of the world's populations are women, yeah? And in Africa, more than half is beyond 20 years old. There is a lot of hope, but we need good leadership. Yes. And we have had some amazing thoughts here up on the stage. And I would like to say thank you to you all. And I'm going to not say heja, heja for Sverige, but to Switzerland. No, I'm just joking. No, I mean, really, I hope you take some really thoughtful thoughts with you and go out there and do the work that needs to be done. We need to be brave. Democracy is not there to just enjoy. We need to work and fight for it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.